Hey guys, this is Harrison alongside Josh, and this is the Awkward Sports Podcast. Tomorrow, or if you're watching this tomorrow, today is the Florida Georgia game. It's going to be a big one. Number one Georgia against unranked, but still 5-2 Florida Gators. Biggest rivalry. Well, the one of the biggest rivalries for both schools, the world's largest outdoor cocktail party. I don't necessarily care if that's no longer the official name. There's nothing else to describe it. Miles and miles. There's RVs, crushed cans of White Claw, and just so many people in different blue and red outfits ready to go absolutely nuts over a single football game. And they're even there partying, even if they don't give a crap about football. It's just that big of a deal.
Oh yeah, I mean they've been there for at least a week. I mean they're all getting ready, getting set
Some
up,
people are probably still recovering from their hangover last year.
and that's what's so great about this rivalry. I'm so glad you brought that up from last year, and I think you can kind of take into the account throughout the history of this game. I mean, even the players have brought up the point that you just made, right? Like if you watched Swamp Kings, obviously they talk. A lot of the players talked about '07 and how it was 365 days of embarrassment to then follow it up with the revenge game in '08, which was spectacular. And I think you can kind of sum up what this rivalry has been about in just those two games. The fact that it can go either way, despite who is the better team coming into the game. A neutral site game, obviously, both fan bases always show out for this game. It's divided down the middle per usual, and it's something that down south, it's obviously, if you look at all the biggest rivalries in college football, it's not obviously a Michigan Ohio State thing per se, which is probably the
No,
greatest rivalry in college football.
I mean, that's
But
just Michigan, Ohio State. It's just so up there. That's a Yankees, Red Sox kind of thing, where it's just on another level.
it's on another level. I'm going to talk about the other part of that a little bit later. But down here in the SEC, it's one of the biggest rivalries we have, and I mean, it is one that determines the outlook of which team could go to the SEC championship in most years. Obviously, this year, other teams are in the mix as well. But I mean, you look at both of these teams. We've talked about Florida. We've talked about how dominant Georgia has been. The last time Georgia lost a regular season game was right here in Jacksonville, and it was to Florida. And it was in 2020 with Kyle Trask and Dan Mullen and Kyle Pitts. And again, that Georgia team was also banged up. Well, they're banged up again this year, albeit the number one team in the country, Florida being unranked. I think, Harrison, this is going to be closer of a game than most people do.
I would go with that too. Most of the spreads I have seen have Georgia favored by 14 and a half or more, which is, not just two scores, two whole touchdowns. In college football, that's already starting, I mean, it's not quite as if you're favored by 14 in the NFL, which I think I've never seen at all. But that's still saying this team is a lot better than you. You have to be two very considered equal teams to have it where you are only favored by single digit points in college football, just because we are so used to seeing all kinds of crazy blowouts here and there and everywhere. But I think it's the same case. You've seen how Georgia's played in the first half of games this year. You've seen how they play in another very important rivalry game. Deep South sold this rivalry with Auburn. They had to pull a comeback in that one. They even had troubles with, I believe it was Mizzou, they even had some trouble with early on in that game. You just never know what can happen, really. When you have two teams, it's why the Iron Bowl, arguably the biggest, if not the second biggest behind Florida, Georgia, when it comes to a rivalry in the SEC. Those are the games where no matter how good someone is, no matter how bad a team is, someone is going to step up. It's going to be interesting one way or another. I say this as if 2 years ago, Florida got absolutely creamed, but that was also a Florida team that was slowly checking out player by player, day by day. Even last year, a Florida team that went 6-6. It was 28-20 late into the third quarter before Georgia pulled away just because they were better. I think this Florida team is definitely better than last year's, even if Anthony Richardson is not the guy lined up under center. As a team, they are better, which in college football is huge. I mean, not that, one quarterback can't elevate everybody, but that was not what happened with Anthony Richardson. They've just looked better. And I think this team overall, because they're improved, the defense is night and day improved. They might give Georgia some trouble. I'm not saying Florida's going to win. I would not make that score prediction. I'm not on. There is no drug in the world you can put me on that would get me to say Florida is going to beat Georgia tomorrow. But I am crazy enough to say that Florida will make this one. I think they will cover. I can see it where they lose by like 8 points or something like a 34-26. That's not my score prediction. I'm just throwing an example out there.
Right, and I think I think there's some drugs you can put me on to get me to say Florida's going to win this game this week. Obviously, I'm fired up for
You
tomorrow.
think Florida's going to win?
Do I think? Man, I mean, should I say it? Should I not say it? I don't know. I don't want to spoil the magic, but I mean, I feel like you look at these two teams. I think it'll be closer, but again, it comes down to how they start out. I think I feel like I have been hammering this home all week long. Florida has to start out fast. They have to get out in front
100%.
of Georgia. And if they can get out in front of them and get their crowd involved into the game, it, I think, can make a difference. Once they do that, force a turnover, do something spectacular, get Georgia reeling a little bit. It's going to depend entirely how they start this game. That's the only reason why I can't sit here right now and say Florida is going to win this game, because I don't know how they're going to start this game. If somebody
Even
told
then, it's still Georgia. This is a team, no matter how they have started, are still 7-0.
Yeah, they find ways to win too. But I will say this. I'm not going to come out right and say Florida's going to win this game. But if I came into this game and you told me like there's 7 minutes left in the first quarter and Florida's up 10-0, be like, yeah, I think Florida can win this game. I think they can.
Okay, but that's in one single hypothetical. Yeah, if I think Florida goes up by 2 scores early, of course I'm going to be very confident that they can win this game. Anytime you're up 10-0, you should be confident that you can win this game. Especially, well, hear me out. Especially because it's a big rivalry game too. I'm not saying if Vanderbilt flukes up 10-0 early, they should be confident, or if the Citadel ties Bama 10-10, that was an actual score at halftime. In 2018, go Google it.
Right.
That doesn't mean you should be confident, but Florida, in the SEC, it is different. Even with Georgia, they're not the Georgia team that they have been the last 2 years. That doesn't mean I think Georgia wins this game. But if Florida goes up 10-0, there is every reason to be confident that they can win this game.
So before I get flamed for what I said here, right? The line for this game is Georgia by 14. That's the experts telling.
They moved it to 14 from 14.5.
It's 14.
Okay.
So that's the experts telling us that even if we did have a 10-point lead, we shouldn't win this game. So it isn't like, oh, well,
but I think the spread is supposed to indicate that the Gators are not going to go up 10-0 at all.
Exactly. But my point being is, even if it were, they think Georgia is a 14-point favorite. So the final score would still hypothetically be like 24 Georgia, 20 Florida, right? Like it would be something along those lines. I don't think just because you get up 10 points in college football, I think you should be very confident, let alone a done deal against the #1 team in the country.
I was just saying Florida is a team compared to most other schools where you can be more confident in saying they're going to win this game. There's a difference between saying I'm not saying anyone should ever be confident when they're up 10-0. That's a touchdown, a field goal. But I'm saying they can be more confident than other teams, especially if you look at Auburn. You saw they almost won against Georgia. I don't care if it was at Auburn. But so like if you're not in Athens and you're up 10-0 and you look at a team that is inferior to you, almost beat Georgia, there's no reason you can't look at them and say, if we go up 10-0, there's no reason we can't go win this game, because Florida will be able to say better offense, They showed that they can finally win. They have that confidence boost from South Carolina. South Carolina, not a good team, even if they're maybe a little bit better than their record, but they finally have shown it can be done. They can win without the swamp. And what's helpful too, in Jacksonville, you have half of that still. You're going to have a whole blue side that is screaming so loud, none of them are going to have voices for classes on Monday.
Well, one last thing I will say about this particular matchup going into it, right? It gives Florida a 14.8% chance to win. I do think
What you're
again
saying is there's a chance.
there is a chance, but it just kind of speaks to the volume and the odds of how much the odds are stacked against the Gators.
I still think 14% sounds about right, by the way. No
Yeah,
matter
and
how much I say they should be confident, that sounds about right.
right, and it's like that's telling them like what could happen, right? So it's like that's like about 86% chance that Georgia's going to win this game. Yeah, I mean, if they're going to give you 14, spot me 10. I like our chances. Obviously not. That's kind of the point I was making here. But obviously, we can talk about how big this game really is to University of Florida, to Georgia fans, to Florida fans. I mean, I look at this matchup, Harrison. I look at this rivalry that Florida has against Georgia, the Florida Georgia rivalry, the greatest, the largest outdoor cocktail party. I think it's the biggest rivalry that Florida has. I think it's one of those that
Okay.
always it impacts your chances of going to the college football playoff. In a perfect world where both teams are good, you need to go through Georgia to get through the East to get to the conference championship game. I know some people have been raised from birth to believe it's Florida State because of the
Me.
in-state rivalry, because they're both
I'm about to
in the
defend why you're wrong in a moment.
and before you do, I want to make this point crystal clear because you brought up a baseball rivalry earlier on in this podcast that I think is very relevant to this matter. And you brought it up yourself. The Red Sox and the Yankees, we know that is the greatest rivalry in baseball. Notice how that isn't the New York Mets and the New York Yankees. It's the
Okay, but I'm going to show you in a minute too why
before,
that analogy doesn't necessarily work.
hold on, before I give you the floor, I want to finish my point here where it's like the Red Sox and the Yankees, they're in the same division. You have to go through one or the other to get to the playoffs. It matters. Florida has to go through Georgia to get to the SEC championship and then maybe to get to the playoff. If you look at Florida and Florida State, Florida doesn't have to go through Florida State to get anywhere. If hypothetically
That is
speaking,
not true.
hold on.
The precedent even tells you that's not true.
Let me explain to you why it is. Because if let's say Florida lost to Florida State, but they were undefeated in conference play, they are still going to the playoff. They are still not only going to the SEC championship because they're perfect in conference play, they are going to the playoff. And then the only way they would hypothetically still be in the way of Florida State is if Florida State also made it to the playoff and they had to play them again. Who's to say that Florida State doesn't beat them in a down year, like an 8-4 year? So like Florida doesn't have to go through them. You know who does? The biggest rivalry for Florida State is Miami. Why? Because Miami is in the ACC with Florida State, and those two teams have to go through each other.
I think you're being almost just a bit too technical in why they're big. Rivalries are not logical. I just want to point that out now. And by the way, you bring up the Mets and versus the Red Sox.
Mets, Yankees,
Mets, sorry. I don't know why I said Mets, Red Sox, even though
that
was World Series. And that has been a World Series, by the way, in 86, but that's beside the point. Go watch Once Upon a Time in Queens. It's actually really good.
It is good.
I don't know if that's even a fair comparison. Yankees, Mets, and Yankees, Red Sox. Just because the Yankees and Mets more just hate each other because they're in the city. It has nothing really to do. They don't. Most of the first 30 years the Mets existed, they couldn't even play the Yankees in the regular season. They have played each other in the World Series once. Yeah, now they play annually. They play 6 games a year. But Yankees Red Sox is on a completely different level. That rivalry existed before, and I guess you can make the same argument of Florida Georgia versus Florida State, where Yankees and Red Sox were a bigger rivalry before the Mets even came along. Yeah, FSU didn't have a football team until after World War II because they used to be a women's school. But, and so Florida Georgia is already longer. I get longer lasting rivalry. I will not deny Florida Georgia is an event. But this is also Florida State matters. Do you know that was originally a government mandated game?
Oh, it still matters.
The government of Florida mandated these two teams play each other in the 1950s. It has only been interrupted by the SEC not wanting to have an out-of-conference game. I do not believe for a second the Gators or Florida State did not want to play each other in 2020. And I know I'm going to go before the college football playoff, but history suggests that Florida State can hurt your national championship chances. I'm not talking the Sugar Bowl in 97. Go to rivalry week a few weeks earlier where the Gators were number 1 and Florida State was about number 3 and they lose a close one at the Doak.
And then what happens?
Florida State goes to number 1. Florida goes to number 3. And even though they beat Florida State, they were no longer in the driver's seat because they had to wait for Arizona State to lose their game.
Yes. But you see that point that you just made, it almost in a way helps my point, even though they did need some help. They did lose to Florida State, but they still were able to play them again for the national championship.
But what if they weren't able to?
If you lose to Georgia, you're not playing them again, period. You got to wait the 365 days.
Not true. For example, we already know interconference national championship games can happen. Alabama's played LSU and they're in the same division. I know that's BCS, but that has happened. Georgia has played Alabama twice in the last few years.
Under the current format is what I'm getting at, right? Obviously, so like you can't.
Okay, so are you saying next year when there's no more divisions, does it de-emphasize Florida, Georgia? Or is it just the bigger, or is it only the better, or is it only the bigger rivalry because 2014 to now?
It could. I'm not here to say that it won't, but from the beginning to where we are now, obviously I can't tell the future. It could. If Florida ends up not playing Georgia every year, which I don't think will happen, I think that'll probably be the every game schedule they have. But with the expanded playoff and with how the realignment's going, it could impact that down the road. And maybe down the road, we do look at Florida State as the biggest rival. Once again, this has nothing to do with Georgia being better recently. By the way, Florida State's number 4 this year, but it has nothing to do with Georgia being better recently to me. It's about who you have to go through.
I'm not saying Georgia being better recently. I'm talking about the formats.
Right. And under the current format, there's no question that Florida Georgia is the biggest rivalry.
Now, here's where I'm going to pick your wording: bigger game or bigger rivalry, because I think those can also be two different things. Because if you go to students and you go to alumni, you talk about who would you rather beat. And I did a poll on Twitter after Georgia won the national championship 2 years ago. Their first of 2. I went, Florida fans, who would you rather see win? Georgia or Florida State? I had results that were more than 2/3 said they would rather see Georgia win a national championship over Florida State. That's not just slim margins. That's a blowout consensus.
Depending on the number size, yes. But I do think
I don't know many Florida State fans that hate Miami more than Florida.
No, and you're right. And
rivalry week for a reason. Down to the emotional side of things, Florida State means more. There is bigger game versus bigger rivalry. And when it comes down to the idea of if you can at least if you're going to go 1 in 10, who is the school that will give you the consolation that says, at least we beat insert school here? Both sides are going to say, oh, at least we beat Florida, or at least we beat Florida State. Those are the two. And that is what the strong majority of students at each school see. And again, Florida, Georgia right now is the bigger game. The bigger event is the world's largest outdoor cocktail party. There is nothing like going to Jacksonville and partying out there with all those cans and everything, just painting and blanketing the asphalt. This is literally the ultimate party. I cannot believe they dropped the name world's largest outdoor cocktail party.
And
But
I will. And
but if, and you'll get the platform in 10 seconds. When you talk about which rivalry means more, it is 100% Florida State. And I will be back to defend this case again after Thanksgiving. Because you better believe we'll have this debate again for rivalry week. You have to.
I can't wait. And I will concede this. I will concede this to you because you are right about this one thing. Most people would agree with you. What I am saying, and this doesn't change what I have believed from how many years back to now, is that although more people agree with you, I think we have a misunderstanding. I think us as a student body, I think Florida State as a student body as well.
You think we just have all of our priorities wrong?
Of what the biggest rivalry is here. And that's why I brought in the Red Sox Yankees, or I could bring in Michigan, Ohio State. There's a reason why that's the biggest rivalry, not just because they've been playing long, but because they've been in the same conference. They've been in the same division.
Both schools also just hate each other's guts.
Yes, because they go out, they play each other every year, and the playoff, or what back then the BCS, the playoff, whatever it was even before that, you had to go through one of those teams and you weren't really playing them again. It was that big. And I also agree that I do think Florida Georgia is the bigger game, but that's the point that I am trying to hit home. I agree with you that most people at Florida and most people at Florida State would agree that they do not like the other more. Completely agree with that. I do not think for a moment that Florida fans, Florida and Georgia, like, have that. It's more maybe now more for Georgia because Georgia Tech's
no, like it's definitely skewed it a bit the last few years because the Georgia game has meant more. But when you ask the consensus,
yeah, no, I agree with that. You don't even have to hit you went on I completely agree. Even before you went on that big long rant about it, I completely agree.
I consider that not just a rant.
Yeah,
that is my speech. That is,
no. And I agree. I completely agree with it but that's why I'm here. That's why I'm here to say that I truly believe that Florida Georgia is the biggest rivalry for under the current format, under the past format. They've played for 54 more years together than Florida State has been. Yes, the government mandated it. I get it. It's still a big game.
I can get on board with the idea it's the rivalry with more at stake.
But because of that, that's why I think that's why I personally think, obviously I'm in the minority here, that's why I think it's the bigger rivalry. Boston has to go through New York to get to where they want to go. Michigan has to go through Ohio State. All these other ones. And I'm basically saying, since all of those make sense to people, why doesn't this? Why do we have this raised from birth? Oh, well, because they're in the same state as us. Well, so is Miami.
Not even the same states. Like, just think about all the times that just historically Florida State has had championship implications.
Right. No, they have. They have because they've both been good at different times and at the same time as well. It's a great rivalry. I'm not saying it's not, but what I'm saying is why does everyone think that like to the point that everyone's in the majority with what you're saying? Why do we think that? That's my point. I'm like, why don't we think Georgia's the biggest rivalry when it's clearly the bigger game? Why do we think that? Because they're in the same state? Is that it? Is that really it?
I don't think that's just it. I do think it's a combination. Well, one, it's all regional at that point, because let's see. I know Athens is a bit further than Florida compared to Florida State. It's a 2.5-hour drive versus like 6. But I don't think that's exactly the reason. I do think it also has to do with the history of playoff implications, the fact that it's on during rivalry week. The entire season builds up to this game. And I know there are some matchups like Clemson, South Carolina, the final week of the season.
Kentucky. They play around the same time in October.
I know. But this is one of those examples where this is a game with buildup.
Right.
Even
Yeah.
though there's all the way for a lot of Florida State history, the path to the national championship builds up to the final week of the season.
If they're contending, yes. Yes. Yeah.
Well, no
If like
matter
if
what,
like
if
again, like
one of
the
those, no matter what, if you are contending, you have to go through two of these teams. Because if one of those teams are bad and they upset you, you're out. It doesn't matter. Like
if you're still perfect in conference play, that's my point. Like if they have a bad loss against Florida State, but they win their conference and they're perfect there, that's the point that I'm making. It's like, and this is the last thing I'll say on it because obviously we've gone from more off topic from just the Florida Georgia game to bigger rivalries, which is great. I love the discussion, but I think it's like that's my point. Is we're like we could lose to Florida State and it could be bad, and if that's the only loss that we had on our season, which it feels like forever ago since we've had like a 10 or 11 win season, getting to that game, then I don't think it stands in our way. Like maybe you would or some other people would. Now I will agree with you on this. Obviously, the big buildup, obviously you wait, until the end of the season. It is on rivalry week, but so is Texas and Texas Tech, and so is Oklahoma and Oklahoma State. And I think they would agree that Texas and Oklahoma is the bigger rivalry, even though it's not then. That's what I'm basically preaching to Florida State fans, Georgia fans, and Florida fans around, that we have our priorities mixed up and that this is in fact the biggest rivalry, not Florida State, despite what we have grown up to believe. That is my point. I agree with the other points that you have made, having said that.
But I'll go off my last point. If everyone agrees, then by default it is. Again, like I said, rivalries aren't logical. Sometimes they happen to have logical alignments, but I don't think that's always the case. But anyway, before we run out of time, Josh, what's your score prediction for Florida, Georgia?
The one that I kind of spot out earlier, I'm starting to kind of like it a little bit. I think Georgia 24, Florida 20 could be I think that could
You're
be
going to low scoring game.
I think Florida's defense is a little bit better. I'd like to believe that they're going to show up for this game. I think they will. And I think that obviously Florida's offense is going to be limited because Georgia's got a fantastic defense. And I think that the only way that it's going to be close is if Florida's defense does show up to play. Because again, we've seen flashes from this offense as recently as the South Carolina game. But at the same time, if it's any higher scoring than that, I think Georgia's going to run away with it pretty handedly. If it gets anywhere in the higher 30s to 40s, I haven't seen Florida being capable of going that high against high quality teams. What do you
Georgia breaks that open like that, it's over. There's no shootouts.
And what do you have? What are you looking at score wise?
I think it's going to be a little higher scoring than that. I think Florida covers just like how you are projecting as well. But I'm going to go somewhere more along the lines of like a 33-24. I just don't see a scenario where Florida doesn't give up 30 or more points. But I think it'll be where it's like, the defense gets the job done for most of the game before Georgia really starts to pull away a little bit. And I think the Gators, just because they prep so hard and they know how much this game's means, they are going to get points on the board. 3 touchdowns and a field goal sounds about right, especially when you got Trevor Etienne. I think Graham Mertz will find at least 1 or 2 touchdown passes in there, and then the third one will go to Etienne. I think Montrell Johnson will move the ball downfield a little bit, but I don't think he'll find the end zone. So give me Georgia 33-25.
Not a bad score. 8-point game, not bad at all. I think that's also really reasonable. Georgia putting up 30s can happen. I mean, they have some players out. They're a good team, and it'll be a great one. I feel like, as usual, it's always exciting to go to to build the build up for this game. It's gonna be exciting.
Absolutely. And that'll do it for this episode of the Awkward Sports Podcast. Florida, Georgia, Saturday, 3:30 p.m. I'm Harrison. That's Josh. Florida Gators versus the Georgia Bulldogs. And remember, it's Florida, Georgia, not Georgia, Florida. That I will defend till the day I die. We're all in agreement here. But until then, we will see you next time.